Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 66. We're going to be talking about Color Out of Space, the Richard Stanley movie from 2019 based on the H.P. Lovecraft short story, The Color Out of Space. You can email us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org. Please do. And I would like to introduce our guest who joined us previously on our episode about It Part 1 that we did live from Borderlands Books in San Francisco, Jeremy Lassen. Hello, Jeremy.
Hey, guys. Good to be here with you.
Thanks for coming again.
Nice to be talking movies with you again.
Yeah. Who the fuck are you to have all these opinions about Lovecraft and cosmic horror, Jeremy?
Right on. So I've been a bookseller at science fiction fantasy bookstores for over 20 years. I started down in San Diego with Mysterious Galaxy. I worked at Borderlands Books here in San Francisco. I was their first employee like over 20 years ago. I ran a science fiction fantasy horror publishing company called Nightshade Books. I was the editor-in-chief there for the whole time that we owned it. And I've published Lovecraft. I've published tons of horror. I have tons of opinions on horror and science fiction and fantasy. So that's where my bona fides come from. And I'm a total movie dork and watched every bad Lovecraft adaptation. I actually published The Lurker in the Lobby, the film guide to Lovecraftian cinema that was written by the guy who created the Lovecraft International Film Festival up in Portland, Andrew Milgore. So I edited that book. Came out in 2006. And that was one thing that stood out for me is the quality of this film compared to the thin on the ground kind of quality, even as recently as 2006. It was just like, oh man, there's a lot of bad movies in this encyclopedia of Lovecraft cinema. And there's a lot of stretches of just like, well, it's kind of Lovecraftian influenced and they said Cthulhu. Like there's a lot of stretches to get some good movies in that encyclopedia. And I feel like, this movie and a few others over the last 5 years to a decade have really kind of changed things up.
All right. Sign up for our newsletter. It goes out with almost every episode. Go to scarythoughts.org. Give us your email address, and we'll send you our newsletter. And lastly, before we dive right in, spoilers ahead. Duh. Where do you kids want to start with this one? I have a bit of an agenda, but
let's hear your agenda.
Let's hear your agenda.
Yeah. All right. Well, the thing that it brought up for me is that, so I feel like this movie, although I thoroughly enjoyed it, actually, and I watched it twice and I really enjoyed it both times, I think it sort of fails in a lot of ways. And it is one of those things that I find myself struggling with on Scary Thoughts a lot when I try to articulate what is wrong with a given text, in that this has a lot of issues that are, and without digging into them specifically, like, I don't really care about the characters. Not that I have to care about characters in a movie, but I feel like I should have in this movie. It's not very scary. Not that horror movies have to be scary, but this one wasn't very scary. The jump scares were cheap. Not that I disagree with jump scares, but I didn't like them in this movie. So I feel like a lot of the failures of this movie aren't categorical. They're more just weak examples of instances of filmmaking techniques.
Well, I think you brought up one thing that really stood out for me. Like, this movie really lives or dies on whether you engage with the family and the characters out the gate.
Yes.
The funky, weird, fun hippie running his dad's old farm, the teenage Wiccan daughter, all of them are, to my mind, really well drawn quickly. And I recognized a lot of them, but not in like horribly cliched. Like the most cliched one was the teenage son.
Mm-hmm.
But he was so perfectly understated that I felt like, no, I totally get him. Yes, I see him here.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
And I felt that way with each one of the characters. The little kid, Jack, was an innocuously little kid. Wasn't super annoying. Didn't stick out at like a sore thumb, like, a child actor who'd never been in front of a camera before.
Yep.
So it really, I think, if those characters didn't grab you out the gate, then, by the time you kill them with like pink ultraviolet light, you're not going to care.
See, I think it's hard because if we talk about, let's say, the history of slasher movies, generally speaking, the history of slasher movies is predicated on an ensemble cast that you don't care about and take joy in watching get picked off. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of funny to talk about a horror movie and being like, I wasn't invested in the characters, because I feel like our contemporary filter through which we look at horror movies is defined by characters we don't give a shit about. But there's been this turn where horror movies, I won't say that horror movies now we care about the characters. That's preposterous.
Right.
But it is increasingly the case that very stylized sort of new horror, they try to define the characters really well and develop your sympathies for them, or at least create characters of depth. Like Hereditary, you can hate all those characters. You can be thoroughly annoyed by all of them, but they are rich, rich, rich character studies, all of them.
For me, it kind of reminds me of the kind of family dynamics that, like, take a movie like Poltergeist. If you were to engage and like that movie, you had to be there for that family.
Yes.
The dad,
yes.
The little kid, the mom, like you had to be there for all of it. And you had to be there for like the small bits of mundanity before, the wheels come off.
That's such a great example, because that film has, I think, maybe one of the most likable families in horror. And in our Peaches as Christ episode, Peaches talked about how, like, Craig T. Nelson was sort of like her idea of what like a dad should be.
Yep,
And I think that was really fun. It's interesting we were talking about liking characters when H.P. Lovecraft, who hated humans, none of his characters are ever drawn with any sort of air of likability. Like an entire family will be offed, and then there's like 3 pages of description about what the deciduous trees around them looked like, that sort of thing. I didn't think these characters were bad. What they reminded me of was, this would be, if it was a series, you would fall in love with this cast over an arc of a first season, and then when you raved about the show, you would tell somebody, you got to get past the pilot. Like, it has that kind of feel.
That's an interesting take, and it certainly speaks to how maybe our expectations of long-form entertainment and long-form narratives via serial television have kind of changed the way we engage with a movie like this, where you have to take so many shortcuts when you're establishing characters and you just get minimal slices. And maybe now with our more languid, long-form TV show introduction to characters, we have time to fall in love with them. I don't know. Would you fall in love with the Poltergeist family now if you had never seen it before?
I sort of think so. There's something interesting about the way they are created against, well, I feel like one way that the family in Color Out of Space doesn't work very well is that there is just forced, ham-fisted exposition right up front. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm still getting over my cancer. I guess she had cancer, like everybody just comes out and says, like, I am a stoner. And then the sister and brother start bickering, like, they're the bickering. It just, the only thing is that dad has alpacas. And that's sort of like the only...
You didn't think the teenage daughter's like Wiccan transgressions and opening scene ritual with her kind of like pulling to like save her mom from cancer with her like rituals and invocations, and then her witty repartee about like clearly it's not Alexandrian Wiccan.
I thought that was really forced.
Oh, it's really bad to me. To me, it was like it's as bad as like when the mom's like a stockbroker later. It's like when somebody doesn't know about cars and they write like an explanation of cars into a scene. It's like, but then they go research it, so it's technically correct, but it sounds off. Like, well, this thing's got a carburetor with twice pipes on it. I mean, you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's like it's accurate, but it's hollow.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Although we do know, well, I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more, we do know that Richard Stanley, the writer-director of this film, is deeply, deeply, authentically invested in the dark arts.
Yeah.
Light and dark arts. Although, interesting, backing up, talking about Lovecraft's what's the word I'm looking for? Hatred of humanity, is that I feel like is another level that this movie, it's kind of hard to, you kind of can't make a rule about it. Like with adaptations, I say this every time we talk about adaptations. I don't give a shit what you do with an adaptation. You can set this movie on Mars. I don't give a fuck. But if you're going to replace cosmic horror with a family drama
and a lava lamp,
Jesus, the family drama's got to be as good as the cosmic horror that it's replacing.
Well,
right?
I kind of feel that he did that.
Okay.
This movie clearly was about cancer and about experiences with cancer.
Wow.
The opening invocation was a please save my mom from cancer. The final scene was dude throwing a cigarette into the reservoir. And what is more cosmic horror than like our cells going on a nonstop rampage and murdering us? The color out of space is cancer. And I thought it was like a really interesting way to adopt this cosmic horror story and turn it into a, like, how does a family deal with this destructive thing that rains down upon you and you have no control over?
And apparently his mother read to him H.P. Lovecraft stories when he was a little kid, and she died, and I believe of cancer. So I mean,
I hadn't
definitely
realized that, but
tracks.
I was wondering about his experience with cancer, because for me, like, that's what really stood out. You know, obviously you notice you're getting over your cancer, and they subtly implied like it was breast cancer because like, I'm a leg man, and like,
I thought it was uterine or something, because when there are romantic overtones being made, she makes some comment about the factory's out of business or something like not that. Something like that.
I had assumed from his like, well, I was a leg man anyway,
right.
that she might have had a mastectomy.
Yeah, same. That's kind of what I picked up.
But either way, I felt like that awkwardness of trying to, and then having their first carnal relations in however long interrupted by the damn meteor strike.
Cock blocker from space, man.
That was like, I was just like, yes, it's silly, but in the compressed story of this, I don't know, it worked for me. So I enjoyed that bit, and I enjoyed the sense of being true to the story, but making some of it more visual and cinematic. Like in the original story, the narrator is talking about events that had taken place within the generation, but years and years ago. Yes. Whereas now, the point of view protagonist, the hydrologist, is actually in the mix and it's happening, and he's observing it and he's semi right there for large parts of it. And so that kind of cinematic choice to put the point of view narrator who survives, the guy who's telling the story, in the mix, in the action, was kind of like one of those things that like make it a good adaptation to my mind, because the whole, I'm going to go talk to Joe Bob the oldster who experienced these things, as a framing story, and then flashback, like that creates this huge distance and adds layers that are less immediate. And you throw that on top of the thin family drama, and now you're lost. So, there were different things that I thought worked.
It really keeps tight to it too, though. Like the intro and outro is essentially right from the story. Like the narration is very tight, and then the lightning striking the meteor and causing it to go away, that actually happens in it. And the mother does get killed by the father's hand, although I guess she gets technically killed by the cop in this.
No, he actually shot her in the attic.
Yeah,
like it was kind of like one of those like tricked you moments where you assume the sheriff was going to do it.
Oh, right.
But Cage shows up and is like, oh, I'm going to finally find the stones to put her out of her misery, kind of a moment. And then also tracks to another like visually confusing bit that on second viewing worked. Was Cage trying to kill Ward and the daughter when he was out on the porch when the sheriff shot him?
Right.
But there was that quick POV shot where they showed the shotgun pointed at the well.
Yeah, and the second time I watched it, it was clearly at the well. Like it's really like not at all.
Like he was trying to kill.
It seemed
like he was trying to keep her there.
Yeah,
he was trying to protect her, and so that was unclear on first viewing. But like that one POV shot with the shotgun. So you're right, and there are a lot of bits that are. I felt like the script itself was really focused. Like there's a lot of bits that were set up that were then paid off. Like you might think, oh, well, why is she going to this self-mutilation ritual? But very early on when she was under stress, he focused the camera on her kind of like hurting herself.
Yeah.
And that was before the color out of space got into her. So that little bit of character development was then paid off when, when she's like, oh man, I need a protection ritual. And she starts cutting herself up with a razor blade with like, mystical symbols and sigils and stuff. I was like, all right, I see how you got there. You planted that seed and you got there. And I felt like there were a lot of bits in the script that were like that. Like I felt it was a pretty dense, not very flabby script.
Yet still very long movie. Like the movie is just like H.P. Lovecraft stories, interesting and tedious.
One element of the script that left me wanting, it's the Get Out factor, not the movie Get Out. In the short story, it's clear that they're kind of trapped and they're all mesmerized and they're all out of their heads, so nobody leaves the farm.
Yeah.
But in this movie, characters have long arcs of time where they are perfectly sane and are making not very good self-preservation choices. So, Lavinia going, well, we've got to get out of here. Like, why did that take so long? There's a lot of sort of like the reality of what is happening is not just hidden from the characters and only for the viewers. It's obvious to everybody, but they don't seem to leave. And that's especially confusing to me about Ward Phillips, the hydrologist. He spends way too much time hanging out on that farm when he knows something's really, really fucked up, including him going like, oh yeah, maybe you shouldn't drink the water. It's kind of a little tainted. I don't know. Pass it on, whatever. Like, excuse me? That's insane. Like, he has information that could save people's lives, and he just kind of casually tells it to someone who clearly isn't listening, and then moves on.
Well, he does go to Miskatonic U, which is not a top 10 university.
Well, I feel like that kind of played into their meet funny romance, where I felt the whole like, I'm coming here to save you, I'm your white knight, and she's like, I'm kind of sick, thanks, goodbye. And he's like, okay. Like, I felt like that played into the kind of like meet funny.
It's true.
And also I felt like, to speak to your point about trying to get out, the original story, The Strange Times, went over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And this was like 3 days.
Yeah.
Like, the shit hit the fan in 3 days. And one of the days, like, mom and dad left with the car and were gone for like when she lost time. And also I want to say like the bit where she's doing dishes and she loses time. Sure, we've seen it all 1,000 times, but I feel like a competent I lost time like framed scene, they're really not a dime a dozen, and that one was really good. Like, I really liked her like kind of coming back to herself, and the sink is filled up and it's all the bloody water. And, and it's just like, oh, the clock. And it's 6 hours later, man. And then the brother speaking to that later of like, I don't know, I just looked. And you can dismiss it as like he's just a stoner and like his sister would. But the whole, well, no, I looked up and suddenly it was dark. We lost time.
Well, brings up something else that I really liked about the script that he wrote, which is like in H.P. Lovecraft, there are some stories in which you're like, is something mystical happening? Or is it just, ergot? And they leave little clues in the story where like, okay, he is a stoner. Maybe he did get lost in the woods. And the mother says something about like, oh, is this like the black mold that was in the basement? Like, oh, okay, are you guys already poisoned? Is this already happening? But then the classic problem with cosmic horror is eventually something has to show up on the screen. And then because it's a film, you see it and it sort of like eliminates the, is it all in your head kind of thing. But I was totally annoyed by the first like half of this movie the first time I watched it, and I was just not that into it. I think it's because I quit smoking pot a few days before, and the presence of Tommy Johns felt like a personal insult and challenge to me. And I also knew that like under the influence of anything, this movie would have been amazing. And in fact, I was on a slight bit of mushrooms last night when I rewatched it and thoroughly enjoyed it. So I will say, I think the movie is a lot like a Don Coscarelli Phantasm thing. There's so many fun ideas in it that the movie is great. And you wonder like, man, what could Richard Stanley do with a lot of money?
Yeah.
Like would these ideas survive, or would they be ruined by money, or would he be able to represent things better?
Well, that brings up for me
the dark history.
His dark history, which I think is worth us talking about. Illustrating.
Is there a documentary about
There is a
that
documentary called, is it Dead Souls, Lost Souls? So, okay. Shall I tell
Please
our
do,
listeners?
yes.
And please interrupt with any additions, subtractions, corrections. Richard Stanley, the director of The Color Out of Space, he directed a immediate cult classic called Hardware.
Which is
Oh my God, so good. Love that movie. You told me to interject. So I had to.
Totally. It is a remarkable film, especially for someone so early in their career. And he became a sort of immediate golden boy and was given the reins to direct an adaptation of The Island of Dr. Moreau, which in some senses, by his description, was like a movie that he felt like he was born to make. Like this was why he was put on Earth, is to make this movie based on this story he'd been obsessed with his entire life. And obviously one can take sides in the struggle that was this movie. But I think by anyone's interpretation, he had very little confidence from the producers and the studio. He was given Val Kilmer, who was at the height of egomania. He was given, Apocalypse Now schmuck. What's his name? Marlon Brando.
Yeah, Marlon Brando, who Francis Ford Coppola couldn't control.
Right. And so he's this young upstart director who is given, they're also shooting in the middle of like hours and hours drive from the nearest small town. In the jungle, there's rainstorms. Anyway, it's a terrible, terrible, terrible situation, and he can't hack it. Everybody and everything is against him, and he can't hack it, and he gets pulled out of the picture a week and a half or 3 weeks into production, something like that. And he essentially got blacklisted, and this is his first fiction film since being blacklisted and kicked off The Island of Dr. Moreau. It is a fascinating documentary. I highly recommend it, both as just a story in and of itself, but also a document of how art can go so tragically wrong. It sort of reminds me of that movie, that documentary about the Terry Gilliam adaptation of Don Quixote, where it's just like, here's what it's like when millions and millions of dollars are thrown into a blender and turned into nothing and breaks everyone's heart.
And isn't one of the great anecdotes from that horrible tragedy of that production, like he snuck back onto the set and was in like monster makeup like on the set and in some of the scenes.
Richard Stanley totally went native. He was like living in the jungle and
someone
found him and said, hey, come back and be an extra in the movie you were kicked out of. And he is in the movie as an extra. Fucking that story. Okay, so that's the background on him.
He's also living in France, like looking for the Holy Grail, doing rituals to Yog-Sothoth.
And this was shot in Portugal.
Yes. So the thing for me that's interesting about what you were saying, Chad, about like what if he was given a lot of money, is I have a suspicion that something like The Island of Dr. Moreau, if he I feel like he was like a young Tarantino, for example, where like here's this completely fucking insane guy who can wrangle all these crazy ideas, but Tarantino somehow was able to get a studio and a bunch of actors to back him up and be completely insane and follow a project through, as opposed, like, imagine if Richard Stanley had a supportive studio and actors who weren't so fucking arrogant they wouldn't even show up on set.
Or was given the leeway that Francis Ford Coppola was given on Apocalypse Now.
Yes.
Because you could see Apocalypse Now
Failing.
Coppola getting pulled after 2 weeks because they look at the dailies and they look at the budget and they're like, screw this guy.
Yeah.
Like that's essentially, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think like Apocalypse Now and Island of Dr. Moreau, not just because of like the star, but because of the two competing narratives of like auteur film director who somehow was magically given the ability to complete that clusterfuck of a production versus the one who wasn't.
Exactly. And so but it's all based in the what if. So like what if someone else was given Apocalypse Now a couple of weeks into production, what if Richard Stanley was given carte blanche to do whatever the fuck he wanted? Would Island of Dr. Moreau been as brilliant as Apocalypse Now, or no? Yeah, it's hard to know.
Yeah, it really is hard to say, because like I think this movie is in some ways like a nice little middle finger to like the hipster horror thing that we have going on right now. It's like it's more of a schlocky fun movie. It's like, you know, he is clearly in love with this shit. He talks about like reading Famous Monsters when he's a kid and didn't know there were any other weird kids out there until he saw the letters in Famous Monsters, and he was like, oh my God, I'm not alone. Like, imagine the internet now, like all these fucking furry kin or whatever, they can just find their people. Back then you just couldn't, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, like, to me, he's more of like a Kevin Smith character than an auteur film. He's a dude who's a real deal fan who can make a certain level movie excellently, and people like us appreciate it and like it because he's kind of one of us. But I don't think his taste is there. Like, the reason why Tarantino is so great is because his taste is so great. I mean, the movies he's picking, the movies he's referencing, the actors he's choosing are all excellent. And then there's just artifacts in this movie that show just a lack of just full aesthetic sensibility. Like, for example, the Miskatonic t-shirt that the hydrologist is wearing, it's just off of fucking Amazon. I own it. You know, it's not, it's just
is
like.
Is that a fault in the film? Or is
that a budget issue?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, right.
That's what I would have done. I would have just fucking gone on.
I know, but I mean, we're talking about like
Etsy and ordered my
make
props.
a fucking sweatshirt or something. I don't know. And the other one is the use of like the paperback Necronomicon.
Yeah.
It's the one that we all know and we all see.
But I thought that was perfect because it spoke to her facile wickedness, where she has the sign Necronomicon. Like, I laughed my ass off at that.
Yeah.
But it also defined her character.
But you're making a film, right? And on film, the $60 hardcover version would look cooler. You know, like I mean, I get what you're saying about her character.
Would she have a $60 hardcover of that?
If this was A24 production, she would have.
Interesting.
And it would have been available for sale on
Elijah
their website.
Wood isn't going to cough it up.
Yeah,
no, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like we're getting to the point of like, okay, dude, you're making a film. This isn't fan fiction. You're making a film, so you want to make the film as good as you can. And we know, like, you know, Girl Walks Home Alone or In the Night, whatever that movie is. Like, that movie didn't cost anything. It looks fucking great.
It's like $50 and it looks incredible.
Yeah, I mean, so like we know that like a cheap film can be made excellently with auteur sensibilities, and this movie is not made with auteur sensibilities. It's made with fan sensibilities.
But he put a Babylon Horrors poster on the wall.
Fan sensibilities. Like, fan service is different than filmmaking. And, you know, and then like, look, I like all this fan service shit. You know, I like that he has a reference to Hardware on the wall in the kids' room. You know, I like that Tommy Chong is in it and he's basically a sadhu, you know. But I'm also a fucking nerd, you know, like that.
Can we talk about fan servicing for a while?
Yeah.
I realize that I have as much ire for fan servicing as I've had for fucking nostalgia bait. I think fan servicing is this clearly internet era phenomenon where somehow hordes of opinionated nerds now are able to dictate content, and it's created a feedback loop where that is an aesthetic that has its own values in and of itself. So, for example, at its worst, the final season of Game of Thrones, somehow millions of people seem to think that their opinions about how it went matter, and that the producers of that show should redo it because they believe it should have been done better. And the issue isn't that it should have been better. The question is that it should have been done to their taste. That's not what I wanted the characters to do. Therefore, there's something wrong with it, which is very different from the ending wasn't well done.
I agree with your criticisms on that bit of fan culture.
Yeah.
To my mind, that's different from fan service, though.
Well,
Sorry.
No. It's they're definitely different, but I feel like they're pieces of the same puzzle. It's not a puzzle.
One
they're parts of the same.
One led to the other.
Yes, exactly.
Like this pandering to fans' aesthetics.
Yes.
And like trying to anticipate fan aesthetics maybe has led to the feedback loop we were talking about that now has groups of fans that are whiny about stuff.
Yes.
That
And
has nothing to do with aesthetics, but has to do with their personal kinks.
right. And so if you're sitting down and writing the Harley Quinn script, how much are you creating a deep universe and how much are you just giving a little nod, little wink, little nod for people in the know?
That's all of DC superhero
I know,
films.
but they are the biggest films in the history of humanity.
And they're the sixth stepchild to the Marvel Universe films. Like, I feel like the DC fan servicey stuff falls flat because of that. And that's one of the reasons why they're the sixth stepchild.
Oh, but I think that MCU does it.
MCU is way worse at
yes,
it. Like,
I'm sorry, I'm not picking sides here.
Okay.
I think they've all got to stop.
Okay. But I think like a lot of that fan service culture came from comic books.
Yes.
And came from the culture of, are you smart enough to have read all 10 issues, all 10 books this month set in this universe so you can see the crossover? Do you remember that thing from 2 years ago?
Of course.
So I feel like, that's a definite part of geek culture.
Absolutely. And it is an interesting element of its history. However, my issue is that we are now in a place where that sort of way of approaching creativity is dictating so much.
Do you think that Stanley did that in this film? Was there an overwhelming amount? Was there a small amount?
There was a small amount. I'm not bringing this up to object to this movie. Okay. It's more like it was there. It was fine, but I'm just finding that when it happens, when something smells like fan servicing, I start to shut down because it feels cheap. The way nostalgia bait, the way it feels like when people slam an 80s pop song into a movie, just like, okay, yeah, you can do that. That's fucking predictable and boring, and we've been doing it for decades. And why do you persist on making the laziest choice? And I feel like fan servicing is a lot of that. It doesn't take creativity to throw a poster on a wall in a set. Right. It can create depth. And it can create insight into that character. And it sometimes a little wink and a nod can be interesting. Right. Speaking of Apocalypse Now, Harrison Ford, I think his uniform, his name was like Sergeant Lucas or something as a nod to George Lucas. Right. There's something like that. Yeah. Like little things like that. Like, great. It just adds that little bit of texture in the background. Mm-hmm. But it is increasingly not texture in films. It is now as important as character.
Right.
It's interesting though, because I mean, it's been going on since like Shakespeare's time. Like there's characters that are named after people in the court who would have been sitting there seeing him at the times, like perform those plays at the time. And then there's something like really fun and fresh about the Lovecraft fandom, especially the people who create work in it. It almost has this like this improv yes and feel to it. Like Lovecraft mythos, people are constantly adding to it, and it has this weird, almost shared anarchist kind of sensibility to it.
And Lovecraft himself played into that when he was like, and this speaks to one of the most obvious forms of fan service in the movie for me, when Ward is reading The Willows by Algernon Blackwood.
Literally spotlighted.
Like,
it is shoved into. It's like,
like that was the biggest. Like,
it was like 3D House of Pancakes from SCTV. It was like like a straight
and it totally
out screen.
Speaks to that whole bit where Lovecraft was building on stuff that had influenced him, and that can I think you speak exactly to what was going on with Lovecraftalia and the Lovecraft circle of those weird fiction writers in the 1920s were homaging and talking about writers like Blackwood who had come earlier, and they all picked up each other's balls and played with them.
Yeah, I was kind of thankful for that spotlighting because I've owned this Algernon Blackwood collection of short stories for years, and I've never read it. And I was like, okay, finally. And I pulled it off the shelf, and I read like 4 or 5 of them. He's great. I mean, it's shocking to me that I guess, there's always the people, the things that aren't, like the comedian's comedian, like they just aren't the thing that people know. But The Willows, the story that he writes, I feel like you could totally trace Color Out of Space back to that. Like The
Yes.
Willows is the exact same story, but it's set in the wild. But this is like a slightly more farm version of it. It's an agrarian version of it. Yeah.
And stuff like that definitely worked for me. And I think to speak to what you mentioned earlier, like this is a small film. This is a modest expectations.
Yep.
This isn't trying to, just for an example, this isn't trying to be Mandy.
Yep.
Right? It's like meat and potatoes horror. Like this felt like a mid-'80s John Carpenter movie.
That's why he chose it too. I mean, he said the two driving choices behind it were that it was a small film that took place on a farm and that it was in the public domain. And those are two great reasons to make a low budget film.
Yeah.
And I think like those modest aesthetic expectations that you hit really well. And it's back and forth. Well, like I said, it lives and dies on whether you connect with the family or not. Me, I connected with them. I felt it. The first time I watched it, I was like, yeah, that was pretty good, kind of small. And the second time I watched it, man, all of the little bits that filled in nicely, like really rang true for me.
And back to that whole thing about it being like a pilot, it's exactly like if you go back after watching a show that you loved, and like Parks and Recreation, for example, right? The first season's hard to get through for a lot of people. I fell in love with the rest of it like a lot of other people did. And when I went back and watched the first season, it's way more enjoyable again. And then so you're catching all these little dynamics between the characters, like the names that the brother and sister are calling each other are stupid, but also like very endearing to each other.
And I feel like those names and that name calling like really added an emotional weight to when he was going into the barn to get the tack for the horse. And they kind of like whistled past the graveyard. They were both like freaking out, and they went through the paces of insulting each other, and it was such a like it really spoke to how like that little, like I said about like you set something up and then it pays off later,
right?
Like the annoying back and forth of them like insulting each other like bickering siblings was there for that scene in front of the barn where it just really like resonated and gave weight to a scene that otherwise was like, he's afraid to go in the barn, whatever. But it gave the actors something to hang their performance off of. So I felt like that part of the script worked really well.
Yeah.
And that's what I meant earlier about for me, the script I felt was really, really well crafted.
Yeah, I think Lavinia is not as strong of an actress as this film needed, because she's kind of the final girl, but there's no real final girls in Lovecraft. There's not scientists, and then maybe sometimes they don't make it out. Which is weird. Like,
I feel like maybe that speaks to the like cosmic horrorness of this.
Yeah.
There is no like getting out. Like when she was like hunched over her dad on the porch, and she's like, "We're not leaving. We can't leave. We are staying here." And it's that last shot that showed like the entire family sitting around on the couch was like, I don't know. They're still like their psyche, their minds, or whatever are still part of the alien thing that's still there. And like she had that kind of like, no, like, she was the soldier who's never getting out of Vietnam. Like we're never going back to the world.
Yeah, this might be a transition into the Cronenberginess of certain parts of this film, but it did remind me of The Fly when Seth Brundle's like, we'll be one big family. And he tries to mutate everybody together, which is basically what happens with the mother and the child. And this is an addition to the Lovecraft universe that I really quite liked. I liked the whole idea of these creatures getting fused together. I thought it was a really neat idea. The alpacalypse, totally great.
And the thing that I really liked about this was it was so clearly an homage to like horror movies that had gone before. Like that was the thing.
Yeah, when the mother's head comes up, it's totally like the shot from The Thing.
And the whole dog running around and setting up that was total an homage to The Thing that I was there for, that I was like, all right, the shape-shifting alien is totally gonna like subsume them, and did. And like it was like, okay, well you put the gun on the mantle and then you use the mantle. Like I'm here for that. That was good. So I love that it was like wore its influences on its sleeve unabashedly, and it was kind of the same way where Neil Marshall like made a bunch of like low budget horror movies. And the first time Universal gave him a big budget, he did a movie that was like most people didn't like, and they're like, oh, it's so derivative. And I'm like, but that's what I loved about it.
Which one?
Doomsday by Neil Marshall was a straight up like homage to Escape from New York.
Yeah.
And then it had Scottish punk rock cannibals.
Yeah.
And then it totally turned and it became like Excalibur, and they're in a castle fighting against the old like knights with no tech.
Yeah, I enjoyed that movie.
A lot of people were like, yeah, it's totally derivative. And I felt like you could say that Color Out of Space, here's me getting to the point. You could say that Color Out of Space was horribly derivative of The Thing, of Poltergeist. Like you literally have the little kid coming down to the living room and dad sitting in front of the flickering TV screen. I don't know. I was there for that. And I don't necessarily think it was fan service as much as it was a shared language of imagery of horror films. And, you know, so I thought Doomsday worked because of that. And I felt like this, in a lot of ways, worked because it was willing to say, like, let's just do The Thing. And because the other bit about the Color Out of Space that really resonated for me was, as a horror fan, as a Lovecraft fan, growing up, I had to sit through so many stinkers and so many bad Lovecraft adaptations. Yeah. The Unnameable was like a completely forgettable movie that had nothing to do with Lovecraft, except it had a cool monster design. And I had to hang my hat on that cool monster design for like a decade. That was the best Lovecraft movie there was. And then we had like Jeffrey Combs as like the Lovecraft protagonist guy from like Reanimator and from Beyond.
Isn't Miskatonic the university in Reanimator?
Yeah. And he made these great iconic performances, but those movies were not Lovecraftian movies. Those were Stuart Gordon movies. And he created an iconic performance, but they weren't Lovecraftian. Mm. And, you know, I'm sure we're going to get to the Nicolas Cage being Nicolas Cage bit, but man, if there was ever a Lovecraft protagonist, it's Nicolas Cage, like losing his shit. Like I feel like I'm here for this Nicolas Cage going crazy in the face of the cosmic horror.
I'm totally on board for Nicolas Cage, and there's some fans of Richard Stanley were suggesting that he should just bring back Nicolas Cage in his second and third versions of these as kind of like a Vincent Price sort of move, where it's like he's not playing the same character. It's obvious he's not playing the same character, but he's the right actor for it.
Well, I think actually what I'm totally speculating here, and I haven't read anything online about this. But I feel like Elliot Knight, the Ward character, is probably like he was pretty good performance. And, you know, he's a TV actor with a lot of experience under his belt. If you were going to hang a reoccurring character in your Lovecraft verse on one actor, like Elliot Knight was actually pretty good.
Well, that's what Richard Stanley says. I think that he's going to be the connecting thread, because he's like, okay, well, if we keep killing off the whole cast, there's going to be you need to have somebody survive.
Right.
I think they would have to do something different with him because, and again, I don't want to talk about it. His character would need to be more like a Lovecraftian scholar, but if he is going to recur, I am really left with a lot of questions about his character. Like, all I know about his character from this movie is that he's a scientist, he doesn't scare off easy, and he likes teenage girls, doesn't send him packing. So if he's going to be in more movies, I think he needs to be a deeper character.
Oh, definitely. The character needs to be developed. I just feel like, you know, given not much to work with, he was a perfectly competent actor, and I'd love to see if they were going to pull off, because honestly, it was his opening dialogue, his opening monologue, the voiceover, and the outro voiceover are honestly what sold his performance for me. He was basically reading the story over these shots, right. and that did it for me.
However, for me, watching the movie, I felt like the movie was so completely removed from him. I think there was something missing in that movie that kept him as the observer.
Okay.
He bookends the movie, and he kind of dips his face in every so often and kind of does a "remember me?
Yeah.
I'm checking your water." But he doesn't appear as a character who is an observer who has seen some shit. It's really kind of all about this family, and he just kind of.
Well, and I think that speaks to this movie setting him up as this is the pilot for the TV show that is the Richard Stanley multiverse.
I would hope. For me, this movie, in that case and in general, is like, I'm excited for the promise of the follow-up more than this movie got me excited about itself. Like watching this, I really enjoyed it, but I feel like if it didn't have the Lovecraft connection at all, I would have liked it more. Because, I'm a little disappointed, like always, whenever there's a Lovecraft movie. Like, I want it to be so fucking good. No one has ever killed it.
I think this might be the high watermark for Lovecraft movies, actually.
Totally.
And that just speaks to, like, they've been so bad.
Yeah. And
I think you could have cut that character completely out of this movie and kept all the horror in real time on the family, like The Witch, like the movie The Witch.
Yeah.
Like, I think you could have lost all that external shit.
Right.
Although the things that it really did well, I just wanted to touch on a couple of set piece scenes that, like, I felt demonstrated the filmic craftsmanship so well. The scene where she's cutting carrots that leads up to why the mom and dad have to leave. Mm. Man, I felt that scene just nailed it. Like, that was the perfect, like, build tension. You see it coming, and the execution is great.
And he's pulling your eye off of it with Nicolas Cage's absurdity. Like his TV interview is so ridiculous, and his vanity of being concerned with the TV interview is so weird. And you really do see it coming a mile away, but like you're also so drawn to Nicolas Cage itching his face on TV as a UFO like person. You're like, oh man, what the fuck is going to go off the rails first?
And also that UFO interview, like, it came out of left field the first time I watched it, and the second time I watched it, I was like, oh, like, actually this sets up a crazy amount of the world building, because his interaction with the mayor, he's like, hey mayor, my son is sick. And the mayor is basically like, yep, should have sold me your farm, sucker. Bye-bye. And you're like, what? And minutes before that, the Nicolas Cage character was like, I really don't want any media about this. And the next thing you know, like, the media is there being like, UFO nut.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was like a big FU from the mayor, which is paid off in like the radio voiceovers and TV voiceovers later, where the mayor is talking about creating the reservoir. And so it's clear in the outro that the mayor eventually did buy the farm, and the reservoir covered up the family farm that she previously had been unable to buy.
Yeah.
And that kind of establishes why there might have been a little bit of tension between the teenage daughter and the hydrologist earlier on, where she was like, you're on private property, get out of here.
Right.
So again, if it was a better movie, more well executed, maybe that would have been more obvious on the first watching.
Yeah.
I'm not here to say like it was perfect, but I feel like, it tried really hard to like set all the pieces on the table.
It could have too many pieces on the table too. Like, one of the things I think that, like, this is the example we always bring up, but John Wick, right? You kill my dog, I have to kill fucking everybody. That's it. The movie's great. Like, do you need all these little interconnected things? Do you need to lay out so much? Maybe it would have been a little bit tighter if there had been less to kind of keep it's
less alpacas.
Less alpacas.
We missed that great alpaca milking scene.
It's weird and it's great.
On the tit.
I wish there was more.
And that tied so nicely to his wife's breast cancer and not having tits anymore. Like, I felt like there was like a weird perversion going on. And then when he lost his shit, like, another scene that I felt like the execution was phenomenal. So when Cage starts losing it, he doesn't lose it all at once and doesn't keep losing it. It's a weird Tourette's-like thing where he'll be like, caring, loving hippie dad who's quoting John Lennon to like, crazy guy. And before he gets infected, he does a little thing where he's like, oh, my dad would make fun of me. And he does a caricature of his dad. And that caricature of his dad is the basis for every freak out that he does for the rest of the movie after he's infected. So I feel like a better actor could have executed it better, but it was clearly, I don't know, this weird thing that was in the script where every time he freaks out and he does this thing, he's becoming his dad.
There's definitely some dad stuff. Like, there's a scene where he's sitting there and he's drinking the bourbon and the father's picture is sitting right next to him. And then you see the little purpleness in the ice and he's drinking it. And then while he's laying there, he's becoming angrier and angrier. What's funny is he is this ex-hippie who's taken over his father's ancestral lands or whatever, but then he's listening to pretty much like Fox News because the person's like a climate denying pundit on there. So it's like, oh, he's basically like taking on these like toxic values from his father. But when he's freaking out, this is something Mark and I were talking about before we started recording. He's doing like Alec Baldwin's Trump. Like I was like, what is this weird accent that he's using? And you're like, oh, he's doing Trump. Like when he's like, it's his hands, his hand movements,
and the way he purses his lips and hangs on vowels in this really nasal way is straight up Trump impersonation.
And he, for me, when he set that like I'm imitating my dad bit up before he was infected, like. That then kind of infused every other scene where he took on those vocal affectations. And when the wife earlier made the joke about like, I'm becoming my mother. And then prior to infection, she like gets on her daughter of like, whoa, have you seen what you're wearing? Do you know the signals you're getting off? And the daughter freaks out and is crying in her bedroom because of it, because she's a teenager and everything is like super overwhelming.
Listening to black metal.
Yeah. But the mom becoming her mom.
Yeah, like and to her credit, the mom character just goes, "Oh fuck!"
Yeah,
she knows what she just did.
She's a really solid actress too. Like I think the scene when they're in the car, like freaking out on each other, is really pretty good. Like they're good together. But when I sent you that text, it's like, oh, I think he's doing Trump. I went and looked it up online to see if there was any other commentary. And Richard Stanley talks about how there was more explicit, like current administration, like statements and like more like climate change stuff going on, and that he was like basically told to take it out, and it was kind of for a goofy reason. Like he says that Trump basically killed the movie The Hunt, which is not true. The movie The Hunt was killed off, and it's coming back over the summer. Hopefully, it looks pretty good. But this movie, it was going to come out last year, but there was a mass shooting, and the reason why it was stopped was because there's a mass shooting, and I think like. The movie is about like these deplorable types being hunted by leftist elites. So that Trump's definitely not going to say, don't see that movie. He just plays into his whole base, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, or whatever. I mean, like moving beyond the politics of that. I mean, this movie's already so fucking long. Like how much more did it need to have in it? And then we just saw The Dead Don't Die has this really like clumsy, like I'm going to fly into your town and tell you about climate change, Hollywood climate change thing, you know. It just feels like, you know, years from now it's going to make that movie feel really politically dated. Yeah. And I think that the same thing would have been about this movie. Like you could watch this movie 20 years from now in a midnight movie and be stoked on it, and that's one of the cool things about it. And
it definitely got around the cell phone problem of modern horror movies in a just blanket way. Your shit doesn't work and the evil alien is screaming at you.
Nor does the car.
And for me, that was the most clumsiest bit was, and again, weirdly set it up in script when Ward, the hydrologist, his car turns on by itself. Not just the weird radio, not just like that, but the engine actually turns over. Yeah. And I'm like, really? The aliens are like getting in the ignition box? Well, and then you need the car to not work to keep them at the house and crank up the volume. So while it's a stretch, it was like set up that like, yeah, the aliens can fuck with cars. We've just established that. So when we need the aliens to fuck with cars, they do.
Although that's something that didn't work for me aesthetically overall. And this isn't an argument I can launch. It's more just a taste thing.
Yeah.
Is that a meteor hits the earth and it turns a cat into a monster. It makes pink flowers grow. It shoots colored lightning that fuses animals. It can turn on cars. It can also turn off cars. It can make humans lose track of time. It can do this. Yeah. And like the laundry, it can make these pink insects slightly bigger. It'll make a monster that hangs in a tree and will drag a cop up and cocoon it. I don't know what
Angry molesting tree, straight out of Cabin in the Woods.
Yay. It'll make a well talk to a child. Like at some point, I
have a question for you.
Yeah.
That actually, I wanted to get your perspective on. The first time we see Jack like talking to the well, he's drawing and he draws the little like purple insect thing. Is that the alien telling him what he looks like? Or is that Jack telling the alien and giving him form that the alien then takes on?
Oh, no.
I mean, who knows?
Because the whole recorded on reel-to-reel monologue that is your exposition that explains what happens when they go to the squatter's cabin. We can't leave him alone. We got to go save him moment of the movie where you're like, really? Like, I don't know, maybe just get the fuck out of there. But it's like, no, we got to go get the exposition where it's like, it's trying to make the environment where, and it's all exposition taken directly from the story. And it basically wraps it up with a bow of like, I don't know, the alien crashed here and is trying to get back. And it's grabbing all this organic material and shit and making it like it's home. For me, for my horror movie logic, I was like, that's a good enough tree to hang it off of. Like, it's classic, Stephen King Tommy knockers, where it's just like, oh, the alien needs a lot of batteries to like, or E.T. needs a lot of, trash electronics to phone home.
Right.
And essentially the movie is E.T. Like the alien phones home and finally gets enough organic material to create the intergalactic cosmic cyclone that sends it back. And I was like, well, that was the alien's goal all along. And everything else was just side damage to its goal of like trying to get home.
That's interesting.
And then much like the story, which ends with a bit about, well, we think most of it left in the cyclone, but I think there may have been a little bit of monster left at the bottom of the well, and I'm not drinking
the water, yeah.
Like, I was initially annoyed by the little dragonfly bug that flew by on the end credits.
Oh, God, that was so trite.
But at the same time, I'm like, all right, well, if you're going to be true to the fucking story, yeah, most of the alien went home, but we think there was a little bit left.
It's a little residue.
And so, like, I got less angry about the trite dragonfly bug when I was like, when I went back at the story, and I was like, all right, this shit's still there.
It is slightly like the end, question mark? So I've been doing a lot of complaining about this movie, but there's one thing that I really, really appreciated, and maybe I'll lay it out for listeners who are not Lovecraft people, which is, I would be very curious for like everybody listening to this episode, how many of them have read a little Lovecraft, a lot of Lovecraft, or no Lovecraft. I'd be very curious. But for those who don't know, Lovecraft was a hideous racist.
Yeah, go look up the name of his cat.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I don't even know that.
Yeah,
well,
we don't need to
little
go
Easter
into that.
egg for everyone.
Okay.
Go look up Howard Philip Lovecraft's cat's name.
So we'll just leave that. And if you've listened to our black metal episode, you can probably pick up on some other ways of discussing the creations of very, very fucked up people and what that means, but what it means to us. But so his racism is not just like, oh, and also this guy was racist. It's like it is through his texts, not necessarily too often explicitly, but it is not inconsistent with the ways in which he defines horror, and it definitely is in the original story. You can see it. And for me, when I sat down to watch this movie, and also a thing about H.P. Lovecraft is almost every single story, you might know better than I, but there is a scholar of some sort, and there is a narrator who is some sort of outside eye expert trying to make sense of these things that cannot be intellectually contained. Is that true of like at least over half of his stories?
A lot of it follows that formula, definitely.
Yeah.
His poetry is often explicitly racist and misogynistic and like just weird. And
Dear
he has
God.
like
Well, I mean, the
thousands of
color of
letters that he
space,
wrote.
the story, like, man, you're one paragraph in, and it's like, man, not even the foreigners will go to that part of Massachusetts.
Exactly.
Like
exactly.
The scary foreigners,
Yes.
and the scary like people of color are a reoccurring motif.
Totally.
And famously, the Cthulhu cultists were all like people of color from like mixed race Louisiana.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But so I was super like sit down to watch Color Out of Space and like, oh, is this going to be framed by a scholar of some sort? Yes, it is, and he's a black man. This is my favorite fucking H.P. Lovecraft adaptation ever.
And I feel like
I thought that choice alone was beautiful.
And you can tell Richard Stanley's really in it. Like, there's in an interview, he talks about how if he was sitting down at dinner with H.P. Lovecraft, he would probably have a lot of problems with his beliefs, But he was also, Richard Stanley seems like a really kind man. He says like, but he's also he was clearly mentally ill, right? So there's that aspect of it. But then he's like explicitly like, he's like, basically, look, I'm an anti-racist feminist, like occultist dude. So, that's the movie I made.
Totally. Well, I also think that there was also a really interesting line when Ward Phillips is talking to Nicolas Cage and asking about Tommy Chong. Like, oh, there's another guy here, and Nicolas Cage says something to. Oh, I've got it written down. I can't promise he's going to talk to you. And there's this pause.
Yep.
And that
there's
pause
clearly
is
the racial undertones.
Totally.
There.
But then he goes, he's special, and you're like, oh, okay, it's something else. But there's that moment.
No,
of like,
I picked up on the exact same bit.
I love that
because of the context of H.P. Lovecraft, the author. Like that was front and center. In that scene, in that bit of the script. That was exactly what I took too, where you're like, this is a rich, dense, like nod to like the shit that is at the source of a lot of these Lovecraftian tales.
However, and I'm gonna go, this is very lit crit of me to do. So part of a way of looking at The Color Out of Space, a short story, is there is this invasion of color that is tainting the homeland, right?
Right.
That's a very easy way to sort of like look at the racial politics of the original story. Despite the way that this movie doesn't turn it around, but sort of sidesteps it, approaches it from another direction, the meteor does show up at the same time as Ward Phillips. He does, in a certain narrative sense, bring the meteor. He is the invader at the beginning with the meteor.
Feels like a little bit of a reach for me.
It's a reach. Yeah. I'm saying it. That's why I was like, this is lit crit kind of shit. But it's not there.
Well, for me, he's more of an incursion of the state than anything else. You have like this farm and like,
so it's like Ghostbusters.
Yeah, he's more like an EPA
he's the
character.
patsy of the mayor who's trying to take the family's farm.
Yeah,
right.
He's there basically trying to lay the foundation.
Like, it was a great way to sidestep that, like, the scary darkies are coming.
Yeah.
And made it into like, the tax man and the mayor are coming to take our land.
Right.
And if you want to thematically tie it together, there's definitely a libertarian subtext there.
And Ezra is like the stoner who sees beyond. Always my favorite character. Cabin in the Woods again.
He is. He seems to have bonded with the aliens.
And he's even creepier though too. There's something that I don't know if you guys picked up on this, but like, we know that he has cameras and shit all over the woods, right?
Yeah.
When they come up to him, he knows everything already. Has he bugged their house too? Oh. Like, is he that level of
There's
creep,
little birdies all around these woods.
Yeah.
I love that bit of like conversation hippie. He's like the movie The Conversation. There's like wiretaps and bugs everywhere, except he's like the hippie out in the wood. The idea of the squatter, guy out in the middle of nowhere, except he's the high-tech squatter. He's off the grid, but he's got all the tech.
He's got his own grid.
Yeah, he's got his own grid.
I thought
that was from the moment he hit the screen, I loved the character and I loved everything he brought. Like, I felt like that was great.
I feel like you could have dropped Ward Phillips and had his character. Like, for example, you could have dropped, like, a more artsy filmmaker might have dropped the intro and outro and had weird, like, the tape playing over the beginning and the end. It could have been a cool way of doing it.
Yeah, but then I would have lost the actual dialogue from the story and the fan service that generated. And I need that, man. But the other scene that I want to just get in that, like, and the bit of dialogue that just hit like a hammer, when again it touched on the cancer bits, when Cage is losing his shit and he's like, that smell, I can still smell it. It's like that cancer ward smell from my dad. So we also have this layer of like, his dad died of cancer. Then he turns to his wife and is like,
Yep.
you know that smell. And it was like, I mean, it was the equivalent of like hitting her.
Yeah.
Like that bit of dialogue
so brutal.
stung.
Yeah.
Another really like kind of sad part with the wife is like when he goes to put the shotgun next to her head, I fully expected her to do the Brundlefly thing and move her hand up and pull the shotgun over. But she like starts crying, which is really like even in her deformed mutant state, she doesn't really want to be killed. You know, she's already been through all this crazy shit. And then he has this turn, which I think is like, it's so weird, but like kind of like love wins in this moment. You know, like he doesn't want to kill her.
And he goes down and there's the kiss that is reminiscent of their kiss when the meteorite hit. And they have that physical connection, even though it's physically gross with the stuff from her lips sticking.
Yeah.
Like it had that great Cronenberg feel. And he's like lovingly nuzzling her. And I got to say, like for me, the effects of the son and the wife fused together and their like whimpering sounds was like, that was really harsh and effective. And like hit me hard. And so in that scene where he like went and said didn't use the shotgun and like love won, like you said, like I felt that scene was great. And man, he was like, we're gonna fix this, honey. And then he goes down and he watches TV. And I felt like that was the perfect reaction to cosmic horror right there. Because every character repeats the phrase, everything is gonna be okay. At some point in the movie.
Oh, wow.
The daughter, the wife, Nicolas Cage, they all have this like in the face of, man, nothing is going to be okay. There's this reoccurring chorus of everything is going to be okay. And like that was another like reoccurring bit that just ran through that I loved, that I thought worked really well.
There's a little thing that I'm very thankful for. Another one of my recurring complaints is about nostalgia, especially for the 80s. And in the original story, The Color Out of Space, there's the line from the narrator, of course, it happened in the 80s. And then he tells the tale. And I'm so glad this movie wasn't set in the 80s because it literally, like, obviously the original story was the 1880s.
Right.
But it's like right there. And when I reread the short story, I was like, oh my God, it was right there for them to set this in the 80s.
That careful. That was nice.
Thank you for not just being literal and setting it in the 80s. Oh, another thing that was kind of interesting. Daddy can't farm, just like in The Witch.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I feel like that was kind of unfair to Daddy because he probably was a good farmer, except for the whole the crop got ruined by the alien stuff.
Yeah, it's not his fault.
I don't know, man. Like this is something I have a little personal experience with. Is like right after Omnivore's Dilemma came out, the Michael Pollan book about like knowing where all your food comes from. There were a gang of tech people that kind of like were like, I'm going to go farm. And like, I was working at Whole Foods during the time, and then you would have all these like little small farms that were pretty much bankrolled by deep pockets that just would not have survived if the people actually had to have like a subsistence farming. And this one farm in particular was a chicken farm, and these people did not know what the fuck they were doing. Yeah. And like they had coyotes kill like 3,000 chickens at a time, and their answer was to get a fucking llama because like coyotes are afraid of llamas, I guess. And so these like free range chickens would just be running around and like roosting underneath this llama, and you're like, this is not going to work. And then you go to like an actual, like a real deal, well-run chicken farm. You're like, okay, there's a reason why they're inside barn houses, you know, so that animals don't murder them. And then all their chickens got there's this weird chicken disease that causes chickens to like look up. Their like necks seize up and they just look up into the air. The whole idea of like Green Acre style farm living going bad is like a real thing. And when it goes bad, like animals die and people lose their shit. It's just real, you know?
Yeah.
And so
sad.
Certainly, I think a little bit of a criticism there of that.
Fucking alpacas. Jesus.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it speaks to the ridiculousness of the character.
Yeah.
I loved it. I'm totally on board with like Dad's gonna raise alpacas and because it's a joke because it is so absurd, but my biggest life decisions are not that different from I've decided I'm going to raise alpacas. Like that is...
I love the daughter's line about like, people make sweaters out of them, Dad. Like people don't eat. Like I I thought the alpaca bits worked really well.
Yeah.
And another kind of back and forth between the dynamic between the father and daughter that really worked for me was the implied abuse that had gone on previously, when the mom kind of looked at him drinking and she was like, "Oh, that's your reaction to this." There was clearly a, implied history of alcoholism or some kind of bad behavior on dad's part.
Yeah.
And then when the son goes down the well and Nick Cage in his Tourette's state kind of storms out and grabs her and is dragging her back into the house, like, she regresses, like infantilizes really quickly and is like, "I'm sorry, Daddy, I won't use bad words." And again, that "I won't use bad words," the first thing after, I guess it was like the meteorite crashed, Cage is sitting yelling at her going like, "Watch your language, young lady."
Yeah.
And it was a typical back and forth, kind of family drama thing, except she like regressed so quickly in the face of like physical dominance.
Right.
That was just like, ooh, like something's going on there. And man, that line where he was like, "Feed your mother." Oh, he nailed it, man. Like, that was creepy as hell. I loved it. Like that was like a little bit in the horror movie that made the little horror movie sing. Like, I was just like, "Feed your mother." Like, ugh. And then she gets locked in with the fucking spider mom.
I was hoping that the mother would have actually eaten her at that point. I was kind of hoping that was going to happen.
Gotta absorb the family energy somehow. Something just occurred to me. In the soundtrack, not the score, Lavinia listens to Burzum and Mayhem, which, sure, maybe as someone putting together a soundtrack for a movie, those are the two most obvious black metal choices you could possibly make. But thinking about this, that means, speaking of race, that means Richard Stanley, or the production of this movie, directly gave money to Varg Vikernes, aka Burzum, who is a living Nazi, a living white supremacist. So this movie,
That's unfortunate. I mean, should have went with Avatar.
should have gone with Avatar. Or actually, another thing I learned about this movie that was super fucking delightful is that it's like catering, blah, blah, blah. Vegan catering, blah, blah, blah. Vegan catering had its own separate line in the credits.
They should be separate.
Awesome. You're the fucking vegan in this room, dude.
Well, I did have a hot chicken sandwich today.
Oh, that's right. What happened?
So my wife is super vegan, right? Like, she's an ISIS level vegan. And
So that mostly makes you a vegan.
yeah, in the Pulp Fiction Jules transitive property, my wife is vegetarian, so that pretty much makes me a vegetarian, right?
Right.
So I have a mostly plant-based diet, but every once in a while, when the mood strikes, I will go the fuck off. And today I went off at Hot Boys, which is an Oakland hot chicken place. It's across the street from my comic shop, Cape and Cowl. And if you want to have an awesome Oakland Sunday afternoon, go get some comics at Cape and Cowl and walk across the street and read them while you wait in half an hour for your hot chicken sandwich, while everybody in line is smoking weed and talking about the hot chicken sandwiches they've had all around the rest of the country. It's great. And you go inside, and the people working on the line, it's like the Oakland DMV from like a coup video or something like that. There's like an absolutely gorgeous genderqueer Vietnamese woman and some old white dude who looks like he's on parole, and like a really like cool black dude with dreadlocks. And they're all working there. Everybody's having a good time. They're all listening to the Wu-Tang Clan. I mean, it's such a great place to go.
Wow.
Yeah. So, if you're not that vegan, go check it out. There isn't shit except for French fries on the menu that's vegetarian, though. So, but grape soda on the fucking soda machine, it's awesome.
One last bit that really worked for me in the film is like visually kind of defining the space and how the relationship to stuff. One of the very opening scenes, like, she sends him down to the wine cellar to get the wine, which sets up the final scene for Wade surviving.
Oh, yeah.
Him going down the cellar and knowing that there is a cellar and the space and how that's related and where that is was set up in that opening scene where he had to go open the trapdoor to go get the wine. And that was just another example of like a good visual filmmaker establishing the relationship of the set and what happens on the set and where you go.
Yeah, because the house doesn't really exist.
Yeah,
it's just a facade.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was kind of interesting. Like, it's shot in Paraguay, right? Is that where it is?
Portugal, I thought.
Yeah, somewhere in South America. And the reason why they did it was so that the forest would look weird. And it's weird that, like, once you realize it's a South American forest, you can't not see it. You're like, oh, okay, this is like definitely like a rainforest kind of thing.
Portugal's in Europe.
What?
Portugal.
What? I thought it was in South America.
It's the Iberian Peninsula right next to Spain.
Fuck.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
But I mean, weird, like, Iberian Peninsula forests.
Whenever
like,
I hear Portugal, I think
Portuguese,
think
Brazil.
and I think Brazil. Like, so the whole time,
how
I'm
you
like,
got there, man. It's not,
like, I keep doing it.
Totally
like,
legit,
it's just
man.
from fucking jiu-jitsu. My friend, you do not know geography. That's so funny. And then Richard Stanley's South African. Like, this movie was going to be shot in South Africa at one point. Fuck, I can't. I've my whole life thought
Dust Devil, his other movie, was shot in South Africa, right?
Oh, I never saw it.
the best movie shot in South Africa ever is definitely Chappie.
Chappie's good.
Yeah.
Not the new Road Warrior, Fury Road. Wasn't that South Africa?
I don't know.
I thought that was South Africa, and that definitely goes to the top of the list.
I can't believe my whole life I thought Portugal was in South America. That's fucking amazing. Oh well.
Any other Furious and Sundries?
Well, I did read Notes on Camp.
Yeah. So you had this whole thing about Nicolas Cage and dark camp.
Yeah.
Did you coin that? Is dark camp yours?
Look, I've never heard it anywhere else, but it's so obvious. I can't imagine. There's probably somebody wrote a thesis. It's going to be a Zero Books pretty soon, I'm sure.
Are you going to write that Zero Books?
Fuck them. They're boring ass books.
Whoa.
I read Melanchology.
Hey, man, one of my good friends is an editor for Zero
I know.
Books.
But like I get it. Like
I love Zero Books.
You love them. I get it. People love them. Like, I know. It's just like I feel like the dad in Heathers when he's reading the spy novel. He's like, why do I keep reading these damn things? And then, and then Winona Ryder's like, because you're an idiot. I'm like, yes, that's exactly why. Like, I have like a gang of Zero Books, and every time I read them, I'm like, I should have just read the Marx, Lacan, and Zizek that I haven't read instead of reading this person's terrible fucking thesis paper about metal. Like, it's just they're just so disappointing. Like, every single one of them. The only one that I actually enjoy is Daniel Coffeen's, and it's like just it doesn't. It's completely unscholarly, like he is. Like in a good way.
And it's very anomalous for that imprint.
Yeah, I mean the rest of them are, and I've tried listening to the podcast. Like it feels like these things should be made for me. Like, oh, it's like this critical theory look at black metal and all this stuff. And I read it. I'm like, this is bad for theory and it's bad for metal. It's fucking. I mean, I just find it like, I don't know, man. Like, I keep going back to the Zero Books like hoping that there's going to be something.
We won't go there for your dark camp.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
Like, Cage has really kind of established a genre here.
Yeah. I mean, like, he is a camp figure, in the way that, like, Susan Sontag lays out, where it's like there has to be a certain level of earnestness and it has to go off the rails in a certain way. And then it requires a certain person, somebody who is like educated enough, but not that smart, like, which is definitely how I feel about myself. And so, like, to enjoy camp, you have to be a certain kind of person. And then she makes this claim that I'd be curious how she would feel about this claim now, that like the homosexual is the perfect person to enjoy camp. Like, there's something about the homosexual character that allows them to like really be the establishers of taste. And I feel like in horror, the nerd does that job. And so I just kept thinking about like all of his performances from, the vampire movies he's in all the way up to now. And it's like, if there's a camp figure, it's him, and it always tends to lean dark. So therefore dark camp.
Right. That's good.
And I feel like for me, his dark camp started with Wild at Heart.
Sure.
Which was one of his early ones where it was, I was essentially like following the yellow brick road, like this crazy surreal thing. And his monologues about like my snakeskin boots are a symbol of my.
This jacket is a symbol of my individuality.
Yeah,
it's amazing. I love that movie.
That, like, every time I see him losing his shit in like, another movie, I'm just there for it.
Yeah, and that's his jacket. It came from his personal wardrobe.
Of
which
course,
makes
it's
it
his
even
jacket.
better.
Awesome.
Yeah.
But the remake of the Wicker Man that he was in with the bees, like, not a good movie, but him going crazy.
Terrible movie.
Yes, I mean that's the thing. I'm not an aficionado of like bad movies.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but I've seen the outtakes of Nicolas Cage going apeshit in that movie, and I've seen him in a bunch of other ones where it's just like, man, just the clips of him going crazy in the bad movies like justify the existence of those bad movies.
I mean, Mandy was my favorite movie of 2019.
Amazing movie.
Like I
feel like that was a good movie. You know, it was like the vehicle that needed
actually,
it.
this
But I don't mean to go back to your other podcast where you actually covered that movie. So yeah.
That's okay. No, this reminds me of that going back to the making of The Island of Dr. Moreau. Firuza Balk is also in The Island of Dr. Moreau, and I guess
she's a dark camp character for sure.
That's good. Yeah. She pulls Marlon Brando aside in the making of that movie and is like, hey, I want to talk about our characters and how they relate to each other. And he's like, honey, you're young, you're beautiful, we're both getting paid, don't worry about it. And she's like, yeah, but I want to talk about our character. And he was just like, none of this matters. It doesn't matter. And
he couldn't have been more right.
Totally. But, as much as in that circumstance, Firuza Balk is trying to be an artist and he's trying to be an asshole, there is a perspective on it where, like, they're just working. This is their job. And Nicolas Cage has this ethos where oftentimes in filmmaking, there's like, hey, you guys got energy to just do a crazy one. Just try anything. And, maybe you'll use it, maybe you won't. Do a crazy take. And Nicolas Cage is the crazy take. That is where he shines. I get the feeling like, you give him a crazy take and he takes it, and then you watch the dailies and you're like, holy shit, every time Nicolas Cage does a crazy take, it's the one. How can it not be? And with something like the remake of The Wicker Man that he was in, I can totally see him being like, this doesn't matter. This is a terrible movie. I'm doing the crazy take every fucking take. It's the only way I can get through this is just have some fun. I'm just pretend this is all one just big improvisation where I'm just going to take up as much space as possible.
Did you see Bad Lieutenant, Protocol New Orleans?
Absolutely did.
It's so interesting because it was somewhere along the way I heard somebody refer to Nicolas Cage as America's Klaus Kinski, and then which made a lot of sense to me, except for Klaus Kinski is a terrible person, or was.
He's an evil man.
Nicolas Cage seems to be a pretty okay dude.
Yes. I feel like Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New Orleans is a movie that a lot of people don't know about. Like, Bad Lieutenant has this reputation. So the follow-up is called Bad Lieutenant, Point of Call, New Orleans, which just sounds awful. It is directed by Werner Herzog, starring Nicolas Cage, and it is something.
It's not as wild as I was expecting it to be, though. Like, I thought it was going to be a little more off the rails than it is. It's a little more by the books than you would imagine it to be, but it's still like, I mean, obviously Nicolas Cage and Werner Herzog are in it, like involved, you know.
And there are a lot of drugs.
Yeah.
But Face Off.
Vintage. Magical.
Absolutely
incredible
magical
movie.
Yes. Like I will die on that hill.
But heterosexual camp to the 10th degree for sure.
Yeah, I mean, bring back to Zero Books. The other thing I read for this was the Melanchology book, which is the symposium on black ecology, like black metal ecology. And I thought it was going to have a lot of relevance to this. But in the short story, there's like the whole blasted heath. So the whole, I mean, obviously, a blighted landscape where nothing survives is totally in the black metal oeuvre. Yep. But I really liked the psychedelic tones of this movie a lot. Like, I mean, I really quite enjoy just psychedelic despair, like it's that sort of thing lately.
That was Mandy.
Yeah.
I feel like that this movie is in the shadow of Mandy, whether it likes it or not. It's the same production company. It's the same Pink. Can we just actually be
and
that
it's got
reductive?
Nick Cage.
Cage.
I think that speaks to what I said earlier about it being this is a small movie with modest goals.
Yeah.
And Mandy was a bigger movie with bigger goals.
Yes.
And so
but also hella sloppy in a lot of beautiful ways. Mandy,
Mandy was very absolutely agree.
But
in a certain sense, for me, Mandy was not as fulfilling as that director's earlier movies, which his first movie I absolutely adore, and I feel that was the better movie.
Yeah.
Even though I love Mandy, and while this is like a smaller movie, I felt like it achieved things better and definitely was tighter. The finale of The Blasted Heath, I love the visual of him coming out of the cellar and into that utter whiteness.
It's like Budo. What is that? The Japanese dance form? Buto, yeah.
And for me, it had this magical, like it could have ended right there and him in just whiteness. Like the end of, what was that Fulci movie, The Beyond? Where they're in the cellar of a house and they go break through the wall and suddenly they're in this never-ending plane of like shadowy mist and they're in like purgatory forever and you're like, what? And I felt like there was this moment where like the color, like Stanley totally invoked that of him stumbling out into this whiteness and the pullback. Like you could see the camera and the frame moving, but you couldn't make out individual things. And then you started seeing like trees and everything's all blasted. And you're like, is this the apocalypse? Is the entire earth gone?
Right.
And like just that washout of like the green forest and the blasted heath, like that visual and that ending, again, that was a moment that I thought worked really well.
Yep. And
I wish all these moments that worked really well added up to a whole that was like more compelling.
Yep.
You know, if you don't fall in love with it on the first viewing and you have to watch it a second time, that speaks to some failures. I will totally be there for that, like kind of like, it wasn't 100%. But like the bits with the blasted heath and the pullback and that moment, that Fulci-esque moment of like, is the entire earth gone?
Yeah.
Like I was there for that. The other thing I was there for was the music. The music
was like really good.
Right?
Sometimes it was a bit rote.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't mind the harsh. Sometimes it was a bit like, yep, that's film music. And then sometimes it was like genuinely edgy. And horror movie soundtracks can be a bit like, yeah, if you just play two sine waves that are just slightly at dissonant intervals, you can create tension. It's not that hard.
Right.
But
the Bear Grylls Law and Order school of scoring.
But forgetting Sarah Marshall,
he was doing. Oh my god!
I'm so glad you brought that up because I was gonna try and bring that up somehow, and you just went right into it. I was like, yeah, that is a Bear Grylls character. It's amazing.
Oh, I gotta rewatch that.
Now I always think of it like in my mind whenever Law and Order, my wife's watching it or whatever. I just imagine Jason Segel running out with his dick out.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So Colin Stetson.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of before.
Yeah. Hereditary
was his big like theatrical feature. Done a lot of TV stuff.
Yeah, a lot.
And as well as is a saxophonist, I think.
Yeah, he's done a lot of horns with like a lot of indie bands and like Arcade Fire and bands like that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but he does these like. In this movie in particular, these very dissonant, long, sustained, he's probably doing like circular breathing, just endless tones that are just raspy and like impure. And I think it really works in a way that just dialing up some sort of preset on your laptop just can never attain. That was really kind of genius.
I feel like you definitely speak to the point that like a lot of horror movies like live and die on an effective soundtrack. And it's not just a matter of like a really good soundtrack can elevate, a pedestrian horror movie. It's like any horror movie with Tangerine Dream, like I'm there for. Totally. Sorry. I'm just, nope, it makes it work. I'm there.
Yep.
Even though I know you didn't like the Near Dark soundtrack, I'll forgive you for that.
I don't know if that's what I would say, but yeah, a little more complicated. What else?
Well, that's all I have.
I mean, I'll just say that the youngest son, Jack, the kid, I recommend everybody see the movie Greener Grass. I think this is not the first time I've plugged that movie. He is in that and amazing in that. That kid is so puzzlingly talented.
I would just like to point out that Lavinia, the character and the actress that I seem to be the only one who liked.
I thought she was great.
I thought she looked like an Olsen twin on her second divorce, personally.
She's clearly a TV act, like well established, a huge, back catalog of work in TV. And I'm actually excited about her being in a movie that I'm about to watch with my daughter shortly in the next month. Like, To All the Boys I've Loved Before, Part 2, P.S. I Love You.
Oh my God. That's such a good title.
I feel like there was like a crossover moment there that like just because of timing didn't quite happen. But when I was looking up at her filmography and I'm like,
that's great.
Oh my God, like Lavinia's going to be in like the Netflix original.
Is she like a Disney actress or something like that?
No, more like mixed TV. Like she's in The Order. She had a couple of recurring roles in The Order and like actually kind of has this typecast like supernatural bits. I think.
I really liked her in this movie. However,
The Magicians, not The Order. The Magicians.
Oh yeah, The Magicians. Yeah. However, there is a little bit of with her that, when a character in a movie or a TV show is very like sort of like fucked up and edgy and dark, and you're watching an actor who is none of those things, pretend they are, and you can kind of feel it. Like, and it doesn't mean that they're not good at their art or their craft, but you don't get the darkness. When you watch some actors and you're like, this is a fucked up person playing a fucked up character. And then sometimes you're like, this is a very nice person doing a very good job at playing a fucked up character.
Like Fruza Balk in The Craft, you believe that she's a fucked up white trash witch.
Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. Like, like even if she wasn't acting in that movie, like Fruza Balk is the type of person in The Craft where you're like, I don't know if she's acting, but she scares me, Whereas Lavinia, the actress, like, you said, was she a Disney or what did you say?
Yeah, was she a Disney? I mean, she could have been in like 10 Disney movies. She could have been like,
totally,
which is 4. Not dark,
I mean, you don't know what
I feel like
through.
That may have been a directorial choice.
Absolutely.
Like, I feel she works as the disaffected rural teenage kid who just wants to get out. And has a copy of the paperback signed Necronomicon and like the Law of Witches or whatever. Like, she's got her paperback witchcraft going on that she bought on Amazon. And, her, when she goes into Arkham and goes out to the mall to get her like, goth crucifixes and pentagrams and such. I felt like that vibe of like, she's not really that dark worked.
Okay.
Like for me, that was her angsty teenage, like, I didn't think she was a stone cold witch. I thought she was like an angsty, frustrated teenage girl.
I mean, we are in the middle of like a witch revival too. So there's like all manner of, levels of...
Should we talk about that for a minute?
Do you want to? I'm all in on Nuevo witches.
Are you?
Yeah, kind of. Like one, I
think I have Wiccan fatigue syndrome.
I mean, you live near that Scarlet Sage store, so you probably see it a lot more than I do. But
I mean, like, it's not only that. I think that half the people I socialize with are witch identified in some way, and blessed be. But like,
to me,
Jesus
witchcraft
Christ.
is black metal for women. Like, not that black metal isn't for women, but you know what I mean? Like, I mean, it's mostly sad dudes.
It's a similar theatrical putting on of airs. It can be.
Yeah.
And culturally speaking, like a lot of modern witchcraft, be it Alexandrian or Gardnerian, both arise from this mid-20th century occultism. Like, I feel like, those influences on Wiccan and on heavy metal, like, by themselves create the associations.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, I'm like deeply invested in it. Like, I read Waking the Witch, which is the Pam Grossman. She has the Witch Wave podcast.
Yep.
And her book is delightful because it's kind of like the memoir of a teenage mall goth, mixed with sort of like a neo-pagan like spirit guide, I guess. I don't know. But like I related so much to like what she was into as a teenager.
Awesome.
I was like, man, like this is like straight from the 90s.
Right.
I mean, it was from that. But then I also read the other one, I can't remember the woman's name right now, but there's another popular witch book you see on the shelf next to it, the Initiated. And to me, that was like Burning Man girl, sort of a drama magnet kind of thing. But they're both using narrative to navigate the world in an interesting artistic way. And like, I'm so fucking deep into Grant Morrison and Alan Moore right now. Like, I just can't have it not appeal to me, you know?
Yeah. I think that for me, the proliferation of witch iconography and narratives through so much like art and Instagram presentation, it strikes me as being much akin to the pentagrams on Motley Crue's drum kit. It doesn't actually usually mean much. It's just sort of a signifying, and signifying towards Wicca when it's an empty gesture as a somehow sort of like, I'm an empowered spiritual feminist because witch, if to me, is insulting to the history of all of that philosophy and
It's
all
always
of that
been made up.
feminism.
It's always
and
fake.
I kind of go with Chad there.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
Yeah.
What I'm saying does not take issue with that. This is a constantly generating, and all philosophies are generating and regenerating. However, it is a trend.
There's Teen Vogue articles. I get it. You know, it's distasteful for those reasons.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That, like, I'm not sort of like trying to posit some sort of true cult position against fake Wicca, but it's rather, I'm rather sort of going, this is getting a bit tiresome that everyone's claiming they're a witch when in fact being a witch is actually something. It's not just a matter of saying that you are. It's like saying, like, I'm a Christian. Do you go to church?
I think it's like really similar, like in the way, like, look, I mean, like fucking Joseph Smith made up the Book of Mormon, you know, like, and like now there's millions of people living a pretty okay life following that. So if you like can kind of better your life by like dabbling in some made up shit that also makes you dress kind of sexy, I'm all for it.
I was with you, and I will go with you right up until the dress sexy part, because I'm more of a feminist than you.
Oh, definitely.
But I will say, like, my views of Wicca and their depictions in popular culture.
Yeah.
I will let actual Wiccans be offended or not offended.
Yeah, but not me.
But not me. I will listen to other people.
Yeah.
And I will take their concerns into account. I've done a lot of reading. I've read a lot of books. I listen to a lot of people. But it's not a form of empowerment for me. Like black metal was a form of empowerment for me.
Yeah.
And so I don't need to be the person who says whether it's appropriate to reappropriate the N-word or not.
Sure.
That's totally not Mr. White Guy's place to say.
Yeah. Also,
I will listen, and I will listen to criticisms of this movie from any woman who is upset or not upset.
Yeah.
And I will just try and be a good ally.
I feel like this movie, like nobody who was actually into Wicca could be offended by this character.
Possibly.
Like, I mean, she's just seems like a, you know, like a teenage witch. Like, seems pretty legit. I mean, I think my characterization of witches is far more offensive, which is fine because it's made up. We were joking about, like, you know, somebody could probably make the book titled right now, like, Goddess is Not Great. You just use Christopher Hitchens' shtick and just point at it New Age stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it's like I kind of don't believe, like, here's the thing. I don't believe any of this shit has ancient roots in the way that people will like to think it has ancient roots, but
It's
I don't.
all the Sign Necronomicon.
Right, it really is.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I also don't think that stuff is not empowering and potentially metaphysically charged. So that's fine. You know, like that's like the Grant Morrison perspective, or even like the chaos magician perspective. Is it like it doesn't really matter the signifier, it matters the intent and the, you know, the more into it you are. You know, like Michelle T, she's gone full witch. It's fucking great. I love her Instagram and following her. It's great. And then she has like all these little young goth witchling lesbians following her around. It just seems like a cool scene, you know?
Yeah.
Totally agree. Yeah. Like, human consciousness has an effect on the physical world in ways that we haven't quantified, and whatever gives the framework and channeling to that, you know, is powerful and can have power.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
I'm into it. So, yay witches. I thought on one of our previous episodes, you said you would be a sexy witch if you could choose a monster. You would be.
Oh, totally. No,
Are you over that now?
Again.
That was our Cabin in the Woods episode.
Again, not inconsistent with what I said earlier.
Yeah.
I'm just being often skeptical of a lot. I am skeptical with this witch trend. And I am not dismissing how much positivity it can infuse into culture. You know, I mean, it is not unlike my opinion about like RuPaul's Drag Race. Like RuPaul's Drag Race saves lives. I am tired of it. You know, those are both true at the same time.
Like I also am a little bit burned out on like the facile occultism in popular culture, be it The Order or The Magicians or Sabrina. Like, I mean, Netflix is a whole catalog of
yes, it really is.
you know, bad cheesy occultism.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I feel like it's
at the same time I watch all of those.
It's no worse than the cheesy occultism that like filled the pages of Weird Tales in 1920.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's essentially like Netflix is the new pulp magazine, and there's low enough production values that we can do every cheesy occult Wiccan power magician script ever written and stick it on your streaming platform of choice.
Another thing, though, it makes me think about was like, okay, like comic book nerds and stuff like that complain about the popularity of Comic-Con and how all these Marvel movies and stuff. And I've definitely trafficked in that a little bit. But at the same time, it's like, it's great now. There's never been more comic books. There's never been more interesting, like hot women and men dressing in cosplay. Like, it's so cool.
I will definitely go there with you in that the first year when I went to Comic-Con, because I went to Comic-Con back in the 80s. I lived in San Diego, and it was like where you would go to get like bootlegs of Japanese laser discs. And that moment when there was like, no kidding, supermodels cosplaying in the booths as like your favorite X-Men or whatever, I was just like, all right, well, clearly we've turned a corner culturally.
I feel like I won. Like, I got in fist fights in grammar school over reading The Stand and the Satanic Panic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so to have like Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop do an article about witchcraft, I fucking won.
It's totally like the supernatural version of Thomas Dish's How Science Fiction, conquered the world.
Totally, yeah.
There's like this essay about like how science fiction kind of infuses all aspects of popular culture now. And by infusing that, it made the culture and fandom of science fiction irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because it used to be the only way you could get that special magic something was going into skeezy comic book shops and getting those old fanzines and magazines. And now you're just like 50 channels on Netflix with like, here's my 10 categories of supernatural stuff. It's literally at your fingertips.
Yeah.
You don't need the fan culture and elitism and tribalism that formed around those countercultures to get that feeling anymore, to find that stuff anymore. Like, I mean, if you want science fiction, read a Tom Clancy thriller. All it is bad science fiction. Like, all these like techno thrillers are bad science fiction. Likewise, in the fantastic realm.
The other thing that's cool about like this kind of like witchiness is it sort of is a counterbalance to dystopian science fiction. Whereas, the whole idea of like, people imagine this bright future, then we got Star Trek, then people started making stuff. The last 20, 30 years, it's only been dark science fiction. And we've ended up in a dark timeline. And I don't think, again, the Grant Morrison perspective is those things are definitely not, they're not connected. And then maybe we'll end up with some sort of like crazy, like Age of Aquarius wild shit culturally, which would be awesome.
I would definitely like to go to that stub.
Yeah.
Like, let's work to make that stub happen.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So come on, you sexy witches.
God, no.
Whatever. Is Richard Stanley the goth Kevin Smith?
No.
It's not a bad.
No.
Really? No, I like it.
Because he's
I'm
not
good.
prolific.
True.
You need like the one guy who did that one punk rock movie in the 80s who never did another movie, but it's a cult classic.
But you could see Richard Stanley going on a spoken word tour for 5 years. Right? And just having insane stories.
I mean, just on the
Kevin Smith.
Just the podcasts I've listened to, I would totally listen to a podcast with Richard Stanley. I would be totally into it.
Yeah. I mean, just for our listeners, the writer-director of this film, it seems in utter sincerity, did rituals to the gods, to the Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos gods to make this film go well in earnestness.
And
that is an interesting person that I want to hear more from.
This not so great movie made all its money back. So,
good.
Okay, dark gods, you have delivered once again.
Yes.
And now we will have the Dunwich Horror.
Yeah, which is great.
Which is like apparently like announced and in production.
Great.
Pre-production.
I'm super excited.
Yeah, like I feel like Richard Stanley, director's announcement of like, yes, and they will be in the same universe, and I will have a Lovecraft verse of movies. I'm just like, man, swing big. Yes, do it, man.
Yeah. Well, it's his intention is for it to be a trilogy. I don't know if he means literally a trilogy or just 3 movies, but
three movies and a 5-season TV show and like some spin-off comics and like I'm there for it, man. Do it.
Yeah.
I feel like if Richard Stanley becomes the new George Martin, you know, the guy who wandered in the woods for like decades doing like marginal stuff and never hitting it, like, man, I would love for Richard Stanley to like hit it big because his aesthetic is so amazingly authentic and genre
and rich.
Somebody who loves these types of movies is not a cynical, like, well, you can make a cheap horror movie, let's get it done.
Yeah.
There's no cynicism involved in a project like this, even if the end product may come off a little bit pedestrian.
Yeah.
But like you said, man, the psychedelic aesthetic of this film totally pulls it out of the realm of pedestrian. Even, you know, I could argue like, hey, man, it's just a good like Italian horror flick with like, but it has too much plot and cohesion for that, so I can't.
He's got long hair and bangs too, which is always hilarious. So,
and a duster and a hat.
He's just like every dude I played D&D with when I was a kid. You know, like that was like too old to be hanging on with us. You know, he's that guy.
Okay, so what have we learned?
Cancer is a bitch.
Yeah.
We should stop reading zero books.
Uh-huh. All right.
What have you learned?
Those are good life lessons. I don't learn anything.
I feel like my war with zero books is going to come back to haunt me one day.
Totally.
But, you know, we know Marxism is for losers, so.
Wow.
I just feel like sometimes a small movie well done, because I will always argue, I will always be the guy who's like, wow, creative failure who shoots for the stars and just gets halfway there. I'm for that, man.
Yes.
And sometimes the opposite is true too. And this is definitely the case of the opposite. Like, I feel like I'm here for this movie and I kind of loved it. And it held up on a rewatch.
Yeah.
Better than the first watch.
Yeah.
For me. So I felt like this speaks to some intrinsic quality to it.
Yeah, I feel like I had a lot of negative things to say about that, but I think that is not entirely owing to this movie being a failure. It was more about me loving enough of it that I wanted more.
And it suffered under the burdens of being a Lovecraft adaptation, and
Fully.
I want a cosmic horror thing, and I want to, like, you set up all kinds of expectations for that.
Absolutely.
Mushrooms certainly helped on the second watching.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Not walking that road with you, I'm afraid. Is that it?
That's it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jeremy.
It was a blast. I was glad to talk with you guys.
Yeah, totally. All right, let's leave it there. Email us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org, and thanks for listening.